The Walmart store stood quiet, bathed in the cold glow of fluorescent lights. It was just past midnight, the kind of hour when the store seemed more like a haunted maze than a retail space. Samantha had only been working here for a few weeks, but she had already grown accustomed to the eerie silence. The hum of the air conditioning, the sound of the rolling carts in the distance. It was all part of the routine. But tonight, something felt different. She had been restocking shelves in the electronics aisle when she noticed it. A soft scraping sound, almost like nails dragging across the floor, echoed through the aisles. Samantha froze, looking around. No one else was in sight. She shook her head, convinced it was just her imagination playing tricks. After all, the store was always quiet at night. But the sound came again, louder this time, followed by a cold gust of wind. She pulled her jacket tighter around her, glancing around nervously. She tried to ignore it, continuing her work, but it was hard to shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. As she turned to head down the next aisle, she caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of her eye. A shadow, just a flicker, darting across the end of the aisle. Samantha stopped dead in her tracks. The shadow had been too quick to belong to a person, and the aisle was empty. Her heart began to race, but she convinced herself it was just the low lighting playing tricks on her mind. The door to the store's main entrance opened with a soft chime, and a figure stepped inside. Samantha glanced over her shoulder. A man, tall and unkempt, dressed in an old-fashioned suit. He looked out of place, almost like he had stepped out of another time. He didn't seem to notice Samantha as he walked past her, heading deeper into the store. She watched him for a moment, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. There was something unsettling about him, like he wasn't really there. As the man moved down the aisles, Samantha heard him mumbling softly, though she couldn't make out the words. Her curiosity got the best of her, and she followed him from a distance, careful to stay out of sight. He stopped near the back of the store, in front of the storage room where no one ever went. The man stood there for a long moment, staring at the door. Then, as if sensing her presence, he turned slowly toward her. "Do you know what's hidden down there?" he asked in a low, raspy voice. Samantha's stomach turned. She hadn't realized she had been standing so close. But there she was, just a few feet away from him. She shook her head, unsure of what he meant. He smiled, but it was an unsettling smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. Behind that door, there are things you don't want to know. Things that shouldn't be uncovered. Samantha didn't know how to respond. She opened her mouth, but the words didn't come. Instead, she stood there, staring at the strange man, feeling a sudden chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Before she could ask him more, the man turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the store. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she forced herself to move, shaking off the weird encounter. She had to finish her shift, but as she made her way down the aisles, she couldn't help but wonder. What was behind that door? What had he meant by things that shouldn't be uncovered? The question lingered in her mind as she continued her work, the eerie silence of the store now broken by the growing sense of unease. Something wasn't right, and she had a feeling the store's quiet, unassuming facade was hiding something much darker than she could ever have imagined. The rest of the night dragged on, the hours feeling longer than usual. Samantha tried to focus on her tasks, but every corner of the store seemed to hold a secret she wasn't ready to uncover. The strange man's warning kept replaying in her mind. Things that shouldn't be uncovered. What did he mean by that? And why had he been so sure that she would be the one to find them? Her shift felt like it was never going to end. As she walked past the shelves, She couldn't shake the feeling that the store was watching her, its aisles full of things that weren't quite as innocent as they seemed. The flickering lights overhead only added to the unsettling atmosphere. Every time they dimmed, it was as though the shadows in the corners of the store grew a little bit darker. Around 3 a.m., Samantha noticed something odd. A few of the security monitors were showing strange footage, empty aisles, but with dark, shifting shapes that didn't belong. She leaned in closer to get a better look. At first, she thought it was just a glitch, but then she saw it. A figure moving rapidly through the aisles, its form distorted by the flickering lights. The figure didn't seem to have a face, just a shadowy, formless mass gliding across the screen. Samantha's heart skipped a beat. She turned quickly to the store's security system, trying to rewind the footage. But before she could, the screen went black. The sudden silence in the room felt suffocating. She grabbed the phone to call security, but the line was dead. Panic crept up her spine. She ran to the front desk, hoping to find someone else, someone who could tell her this was all just a trick of the mind. But the store was empty. Not a single person in sight. Even the other employees who were supposed to be working in the back were gone. Samantha swallowed hard. She tried to steady her breathing, telling herself that this was just another night at Walmart, that it was all in her head. But as she walked deeper into the store, the sense of unease only grew. Every step she took felt heavier than the last, and the silence pressed in around her like a thick fog. Then she heard it, the scraping sound again. This time, it was louder, closer. It was coming from the back of the store, near the storage room. Her legs froze, but a curiosity got the best of her. She turned toward the sound, moving cautiously, trying to keep her breathing steady. As she neared the storage room, the temperature dropped. The air felt colder than it should have been for a place that had the heat running. It was as though the very walls of the store were trying to push her away, but Samantha was determined to find out what was going on. She stood in front of the storage room door, staring at the faded old padlock that hung there. For a moment, she thought about walking away, but the warning from the strange man echoed in her mind. You don't want to know what's down there. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the door handle. The scraping sound grew louder, now mixed with faint whispers that seemed to come from all directions. Samantha. The voice was low and distant, but unmistakably clear. Suddenly, the door creaked open, as though something on the other side had pushed it. Her heart raced in her chest, but she couldn't stop herself. She stepped inside, the air growing colder still. The room was small, barely enough space to move around. Shelves lined the walls, filled with dusty old boxes and forgotten inventory. But there, in the back corner, she saw something that stopped her dead in her tracks. It was a pile of old photographs scattered across the floor. They looked ancient, the edges yellowed with age. She bent down to examine them, her fingers trembling as she picked one up. The picture was of the store, but it wasn't the Walmart she knew. It was a much older building, with a different name above the door. The people in the photo were dressed in strange, old-fashioned clothing. They smiled at the camera, but their eyes were empty, as though something had already taken everything from them. And behind them, the faint outline of a shadow could be seen, lingering just out of focus. Samantha's breath caught in her throat. She flipped through more pictures, each one more disturbing than the last. Some showed workers standing in front of the building, but in the background, figures were lurking in the shadows, their features distorted, as if they weren't entirely human. Others were taken in the basement, a place the store's blueprints didn't even show. Then, one photo caught her attention. A group of people, tied up, sitting in a circle in the middle of the room. Above them, written in what looked like blood, were the words, The price must be paid. Her hand shook as she dropped the photograph, her mind racing. She had to leave. She had to get out of there before it was too late. But as she turned to leave, she heard it again. The scraping noise, this time from directly behind her. Slowly she turned around. The room was darker now, the shadows in the corners thick and moving, as if alive. And then she saw it. The thing that had been causing the noises all along. It was a figure, standing just inside the doorway, its face hidden in darkness. The air felt suffocating, and the temperature dropped even further, freezing her in place. Samantha's heart pounded in her chest. It was too late. Whatever was in this store, whatever had been trapped here, was now awake, and it was coming for her. The shadow in the doorway didn't move at first, as if it was watching her, studying her. Samantha could barely breathe, her eyes locked on the figure, her legs frozen in place. The room was so cold now, she could see her breath in front of her, thick and white in the air. Every instinct told her to run, but her feet wouldn't obey. The shadow stepped forward, slowly, its presence growing heavier in the room. She could make out a vague shape, a figure, but it was like it wasn't fully there. It shifted, moving between light and dark, its form stretching and warping, like smoke caught in the wind. The closer it came, the more the temperature seemed to drop, the cold cutting through her jacket and sinking into her bones. "Leave this place." The voice came again, this time much clearer. It was deep, gravelly, almost a whisper that seemed to vibrate in her chest. "You don't belong here." Samantha's heart pounded so loudly in her ears that it drowned out everything else. She wanted to run, but her feet felt glued to the ground. The voice wasn't human. It sounded ancient, filled with a kind of anger and despair that she couldn't fully comprehend. She had heard of haunted places, but this was different. This was something alive, something tied to this land, something far older than the building itself. The figure moved again, and this time, Samantha could see its face. Or rather, what used to be its face. It was a patchwork of blurred, twisted features, like a mask that had been melted and reformed. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, were hollow, black holes that seemed to draw in the light. The sight was so disturbing that her stomach turned, and a wave of nausea hit her. With every step it took, the store around her seemed to change. The shelves, once filled with neatly arranged products, now appeared disordered, with boxes scattered and some shelves even bent as if something had crushed them. The aisles grew darker, stretching out into nothingness. The store was no longer just a store. It was something else, a place of old secrets, a space that had been warped by time and dark forces. Samantha turned toward the door, her body trembling. She knew she needed to leave, to get out before it was too late. But something told her it wouldn't be that easy. She reached for the handle, but as soon as her fingers touched it, the door slammed shut, locking itself with an audible click. She spun around, her heart racing. The shadow had moved closer, its form now towering over her, blocking her escape. Her breath came in short gasps, the terror crawling up her throat. She couldn't get away, couldn't run. The thing in front of her didn't seem to have any intention of letting her go. The whispers started again, louder this time, swirling around her like 1,000 voices speaking in unison. The words were in a language she couldn't understand, but she felt the meaning, the desperation in their tone. "You should have never come," the voice said again. Now closer, colder, the words like a chill that numbed her skin. "This place is cursed." Samantha's mind raced, trying to find some way out, some way to break free, She backed up slowly, bumping into the shelves behind her. Her hand grabbed at one of the boxes, her fingers fumbling as she tried to pull something, anything, down from the shelf to defend herself. But there was nothing. The figure loomed in front of her, the air growing impossibly cold. The whispers turned into guttural growls, and the floor beneath her feet creaked ominously, as if something was stirring deep within the building. The walls seemed to close in, and the store's familiar layout began to twist and distort. The aisles were no longer straight. They curved, bending like a maze, as though the store itself was alive, shifting and breathing. The lights flickered again, and for a split second, Samantha thought she saw something in the darkness. A face, peering at her from the shadows. It was the same face she had seen in the old photographs. The people, the victims, trapped in time. They were watching her, waiting for her to make the same mistake they had. "You can't leave," the shadow whispered, its voice like sandpaper scraping across her skin. "Once you know the truth, you're part of it. You belong to the store now." Samantha's chest tightened. She knew deep down that the store wasn't just haunted by ghosts. It was cursed, bound to the land, to the blood that had been spilled on it long before Walmart had even built its walls. There were souls here, lost, angry and trapped, forever tied to the store. She had made a mistake. A mistake by coming here, by digging too deep. The curse was not just about the building. It was about the land, about the dark force that had been bound beneath it, waiting for the right moment to break free. Her pulse raced as the figure took another step forward. It raised a hand, and Samantha could feel the weight of its presence, like an invisible hand closing around her throat. The room was spinning, the walls warping, and the whispers were now screaming in her ears. She could feel the dark energy crawling into her mind, filling her thoughts with terror. But then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. The lights flickered once more, and the figure disappeared. The air returned to normal, and the store was once again silent. The cold was gone. The door was open, as if nothing had happened. Samantha stood frozen in place, her heart hammering in her chest. Was it real? Had it all been a nightmare? She didn't know. She couldn't know. All she knew was that whatever it was, whatever had been awakened in this store, it was far from over. Samantha didn't move. She stood by the door, her body still shaking, trying to make sense of everything that had just happened. Her mind raced, replaying every moment. The shadow, the whispering voices, the figure with the faceless mask. But none of it made sense. The door was open, the cold had lifted, and the store seemed normal again, like nothing had changed. Yet something inside her told her it wasn't over. It couldn't be over. The eerie silence in the store was deafening, too quiet, too still. She needed answers. And despite every bone in her body telling her to leave, she found herself stepping back into the heart of the store, deeper into the aisles she had once thought familiar. She moved cautiously, her eyes darting from shelf to shelf. The lights above flickered again, casting long, strange shadows across the floor. She winced, the sense of being watched creeping up her spine. But she couldn't stop now. She had to understand what was going on. What had happened to the other employees, where the strange man had gone, and why the store felt like it was holding its breath. As she walked past the electronics section, something caught her eye. One of the old TVs in the corner flickered to life, its screen showing nothing but static. Samantha paused, staring at the screen. For a moment, it looked like the same picture that had haunted her mind. The photo of the people sitting in the circle. the blood-stained words on the wall. Then, the image changed. The faces on the screen were no longer blurry, no longer twisted. They were clear now. Clear and familiar. It was the faces of the employees who worked at the store. People she knew, people she'd seen every day. But they were different now. Their expressions blank, their eyes dark and hollow, just like the figures in the old photos. And behind them, faintly visible, was the shadow, lurking, waiting. Samantha's pulse quickened as she stepped closer to the screen. The static gave way to distorted whispers, words she couldn't understand. But then, one voice cut through the noise, sharp and clear. "Help us." The voice came from the TV, but it wasn't just coming from the speakers. It felt like it was inside her head, inside her very thoughts. She reached out a trembling hand, the urge to touch the screen almost overwhelming, when suddenly the TV shut off, plunging her back into darkness. The air grew heavy again, the silence almost suffocating. The whispers returned, but this time they weren't coming from the TV. They were coming from all around her, swirling in the air, growing louder and louder. "Samantha. Samantha." The name echoed in her mind. She spun around, but no one was there. The store was empty again, just like before. But this time, the emptiness felt different, more oppressive, like the walls were closing in, the aisles narrowing around her. A door creaked open at the far end of the aisle. The same door she had passed earlier, the one that led to the storage room. Her heart raced. Was it the same room she had just left? Or was it something else? The faint glow of a light flickered from within, casting long, eerie shadows. Despite every instinct telling her to turn and run, Samantha walked toward the door. She knew she couldn't leave without finding out the truth. She had to know what had happened to the store, to the people trapped inside. She had to know why the man had warned her to stay away from that room. As she stepped closer, the door slammed shut with a force that rattled the walls. Samantha jumped back, her heart pounding. She stared at the door, unable to believe what had just happened. Her breath was coming in quick, shallow gasps. She couldn't just stand there. She needed to do something. She tried the door again, pulling on the handle with all her strength. It didn't budge. The room on the other side remained locked, hidden, a mystery she was now too afraid to solve. But just as she was about to give up, she noticed something strange. A small crack in the doorframe. It was barely noticeable, but just big enough for her to see what was on the other side. Through the crack, she saw shadows moving. Shapes she couldn't quite make out. They were alive, shifting in the darkness, circling something in the center of the room. There was no sound, no whispering. Just the movement, slow and deliberate, like something waiting, biding its time. Her breath caught in her throat. She had to see more. She couldn't just walk away now. Samantha pulled out her phone, using the light from the screen to peek through the crack. The shadows seemed to notice the light, moving toward it, as though drawn to it. She quickly pulled the phone back, her heart racing. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, as if the room itself was trying to keep her out. But then, she saw something that made her blood run cold. In the center of the room, sitting in a circle, were the missing employees. They were seated, their faces hidden in shadow, their bodies still and lifeless. And surrounding them, the same dark, faceless figure she had seen earlier. It stood tall, its shape barely visible, but the power of its presence was undeniable. The figure slowly turned its head toward the door, as though sensing her presence. Samantha's blood ran cold. She was no longer just a witness. She was part of this. Whatever dark force had taken hold of the store, she had now become a part of it. And as the figure's hollow eyes locked onto hers, she realized that there was no turning back. Samantha stumbled back, her heart racing faster than it ever had before. The shadows in the storage room seemed to shift and breathe with her every movement. She could feel the cold creeping up her spine again, the same icy chill that had paralyzed her earlier. The dark figure's hollow eyes still seemed to burn through the crack in the door, and it was as if it knew exactly where she was. The room felt alive, watching her, waiting for her to make the next move. Her legs trembled, but somehow she found herself backing away, inch by inch, away from the door, away from the suffocating terror on the other side. But just as she reached the end of the aisle, she heard something that froze her in her tracks. The voice. It was soft at first, almost a whisper, but then it grew louder, clearer, like it was coming from all around her. "You can't run. You can't hide." Samantha's breath caught in her throat. She turned, scanning the aisles, but saw nothing. The store, once full of noise and movement, was now as silent as a grave. The hum of the fluorescent lights overhead was the only sound, an eerie reminder that the store was still alive, but in a way that felt wrong, unnatural. And then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw it. Movement. Not in the aisles, but high above her, in the rafters. A shadow crawling along the beams, inching closer, creeping down toward her. Her heart skipped a beat, and she backed into a nearby shelf, knocking a few boxes to the ground in her panic. The sound echoed through the store, unnervingly loud. She didn't dare look up. The figure, the thing in the rafters, had noticed her. She could feel it. Its presence was too strong, too powerful. The same energy that had filled the room earlier now seemed to pulse through the walls, closing in on her. "Help us." The voice was louder now, but it wasn't just one voice. It was many voices, all layered on top of each other, distorted and painful. "We are trapped here, just like you." Samantha's breath hitched. She pressed her back against the shelf, her mind reeling. The employees, those who had disappeared, were trapped here too. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. Whatever had taken hold of the store, it had consumed them, just like it was trying to consume her. The shadow in the rafters moved again, closer, its shape beginning to take form. And then, just when she thought she couldn't take it anymore, the store's lights flickered, and for a split second, everything went dark. A cold, suffocating silence filled the air. The voices stopped. The shadows froze. Samantha's breath was the only thing she could hear in the absolute stillness. It was as if the store itself had taken a breath, waiting for something. Waiting for her next move. When the lights came back on, the store was different. The aisles had changed, shifted in a way that was impossible. They twisted and turned, creating a labyrinth of dead ends and blind corners. Everything felt off, unnatural. The path ahead of her was no longer clear. It was as if the store was mocking her, trapping her in a maze she couldn't escape from. She tried to move forward, but the shadows seemed to move with her. They followed her every step, sliding across the walls, creeping closer. Every time she looked over her shoulder, she could feel them closing in. She had to find a way out. But the more she walked, the more the store seemed to twist, to warp around her. The aisles stretched further, and the shelves seemed taller, leaning toward her like they were closing in. And then, just as she rounded a corner, she saw it. The front door. For a brief moment, she thought she had imagined it. But no. There it was, standing at the end of a long, narrow aisle, bathed in the pale light from the exit sign above. It was just a few steps away. But before she could move, she felt it. A hand, cold and thin, grasping at her arm. She turned, expecting to see the shadow but instead, it was a face. A familiar face. One of the employees who had gone missing. His eyes were wide, blank, as though he had been staring into an abyss for far too long. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Instead, a dark, viscous liquid leaked from his lips, dripping down his chin. He didn't need to speak. The terror in his eyes was enough. His fingers dug into her arm, pulling her back toward the dark aisles. "Don't go," he mouthed, his voice a hollow rasp, but his grip was impossibly strong. "You'll never leave. None of us ever do." Samantha yanked her arm away, stumbling backward. She could feel the coldness of his touch still lingering on her skin. The horror of it all was too much to bear. She had to get out, had to find a way to escape before whatever was in this place consumed her too. But when she looked back toward the front door, it was gone. The aisle was empty. The door had vanished into thin air. She was trapped again. The store had closed in on her. The dark, twisted forces that lurked in the shadows were not letting her go. And as she turned to face the aisles once more, she realized with growing dread that the figures, the lost souls of the store, were all around her, watching, waiting, their hollow eyes fixed on her every move. She was not alone. Samantha's breath came in ragged gasps as the realization hit her. She wasn't just lost in the store. She was caught in something much darker, much deeper than she had ever imagined. The walls of the Walmart had closed in on her, and every shadow now seemed to pulse with a life of its own. The air was thick, as if the store itself was suffocating her, tightening around her chest, making it harder to breathe. She could feel eyes on her, everywhere. From the shelves, from the rafters, from the corners of the aisles. She turned slowly, her body trembling, but every direction seemed the same. The store stretched on endlessly, like a twisted labyrinth designed to keep her in. It was as if the walls were alive, shifting and changing, ensuring that she would never find a way out. The whispers began again, louder now, swirling around her like a swarm of bees. She couldn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was a call for help, for release. The voices were desperate, filled with the pain of those who had been trapped here for far too long. Samantha stumbled forward, trying to make her way through the maze. She didn't know where she was going. She didn't care. She just needed to get out. She needed to find the door, the one that had disappeared just moments before. But every turn seemed to bring her back to the same place, the same endless aisle that stretched on forever. Then, as if the store was toying with her, she saw it. A figure at the end of the aisle. It was tall, cloaked in shadow, standing perfectly still. Samantha's heart skipped a beat. Was it the dark figure she had seen before? Or something worse? She took a tentative step forward, her foot making a soft, almost inaudible sound on the cold linoleum. The figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge her presence, but Samantha could feel its gaze, like a cold, invisible hand brushing against her skin. Her body froze. She couldn't look away, couldn't tear her eyes from it. The longer she stared, the more she felt herself being drawn toward it, like a moth to a flame. With a surge of panic, she took another step, then another, until she was standing just a few feet away from the figure. It was taller than she had imagined, towering above her. Its form was shrouded in darkness, like it was made of shadow itself, its features hidden in the blackness. But there, just beneath the cloak of shadow, she saw something. Two bright, glowing eyes, staring at her with an intensity that made her blood run cold. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening, and the store seemed to close in even further. The figure stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate, like it was preparing to strike. "You shouldn't have come here," the voice boomed, sending a shock of terror through Samantha's body. It wasn't the voice from the rafters or the TV. No, this was different. This voice was deep, ancient, and filled with an unbearable weight. It was the voice of the store itself, the darkness that had claimed everything inside it. The figure raised its hand, and the air around her seemed to thicken, like the very atmosphere was turning against her. Samantha felt her knees weaken, her vision blurring. She was being pulled into the darkness, her body no longer her own. She fought against it, struggled to break free, but the more she fought, the stronger the pull became. "All who enter are ours," the figure continued, its voice growing louder, more powerful with each word. "You are part of this place now. You are trapped. You will never leave." Samantha could feel the weight of its words pressing down on her chest, squeezing the breath out of her. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body refused to obey. Her limbs were heavy, sluggish, as if the store's curse had already begun to take root inside her. But just as she thought she might collapse, she heard something faint, distant, but unmistakable. A door. A soft, creaking sound, like a door opening in the distance. Samantha's eyes snapped open, and she turned toward the sound, her heart leaping in her chest. The shadows seemed to pull back, just enough to reveal a small, dimly lit door at the end of the aisle. It was the same door, the one that had disappeared earlier. But now, it was there, wide open, beckoning her. Without thinking, she pushed herself forward, stumbling toward the door with every last ounce of strength she had left. The whispers followed her, the darkness clinging to her heels. But she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. She reached the door, her hand grasping the handle, and threw it open. On the other side was not the store, not the maze of aisles. No, it was something worse. The room was small, suffocating, with no windows, no exits. It was an endless void of blackness, swallowing her whole. The door slammed shut behind her with a deafening crash, trapping her inside. The air was thick with the smell of decay, of something long forgotten. And standing in the center of the room, motionless, was the last thing she ever expected to see. The same employees, the same faces she had seen in the photos, now standing lifeless and pale, their eyes dark as if they had been drained of their souls. They didn't speak. They didn't move. They only stared at her with those hollow, unblinking eyes. Samantha's pulse pounded in her ears. She was surrounded, trapped in the very heart of the store's curse. And in the distance, she could hear the whispers again, louder than ever, rising to a deafening crescendo. "Welcome to your eternity." Samantha felt the world around her shift as the room seemed to close in. The faces of the employees, their eyes dark and lifeless, were all she could focus on. It was as though they were watching her, waiting for her to understand something that she couldn't quite grasp. They didn't speak, but their gaze was a heavy, silent plea. The whispers that had plagued her from the moment she stepped into the store grew louder, more frantic. They echoed in her head, overlapping with the voices of the trapped souls in the room. The same warning repeated over and over, as if it were a mantra etched into her very consciousness. Don't stay. Don't stay. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't move. Her legs felt like they were rooted to the spot, her feet frozen in place. The darkness that filled the room seemed to have a gravitational pull, pulling her closer to the center, toward the very thing she feared most. She turned her head, and there, in the center of the room, was the same faceless figure. It was no longer a shadow lurking in the corners. It was now fully present, standing before her, like an executioner waiting to deliver its final blow. The figure's presence was suffocating, as though it controlled the very air she breathed. Its glowing eyes flickered, and Samantha could feel her heart racing, her blood running cold. She wanted to scream, to run, but her voice was lost. Her body, trapped in the grip of whatever curse had taken hold of this place, wouldn't obey. The figure took a slow step forward, its form shifting and distorting, as if made of shadows and smoke. Its movements were deliberate, yet unnatural, like a predator circling its prey. "You shouldn't have come here," the voice echoed again. But this time it wasn't just a whisper. It was inside her head, deep and echoing, filling every corner of her mind. "This place is where all lost things come. The souls, the memories, the forgotten." Samantha could feel the weight of its words pressing down on her chest. Her breath quickened, her thoughts jumbled. But then, like a snap of a twig, she realized something. She was not alone in this room. Not just the employees. Not just the faceless figure. There was something else. Something far older. The darkness itself seemed to pulse around her. It wasn't just the absence of light. It was alive. It was hungry. The figure stepped closer again, its voice filling her ears with an unnatural resonance. "You're already part of this place, Samantha. You're one of us now." With that, the room seemed to lurch, and for a moment, everything went black. Samantha felt as if she were falling into the endless abyss beneath her. There was no ground beneath her feet, no walls, no ceiling. Just darkness, consuming her from every side. And then, suddenly, she was back in the store. It was as if no time had passed, as though nothing had happened. She blinked, disoriented, her surroundings familiar, yet strangely altered. The aisles were the same, the lights flickered overhead, but something was wrong. Something in the air felt different. The store was still alive, still pulsating with a dark energy. She stepped forward, unsure of what to do. The doors, once again, were gone. The exit sign had disappeared, leaving her with no way out. The shadows followed her, but now they weren't just shadows. They were watching her, moving in unison, as if they were connected to her, waiting for her next move. Samantha reached for her phone, her hands shaking as she tried to call for help. But the screen was cracked, the battery dead, as if it had been drained completely. Panic started to rise in her chest. She was trapped, completely and utterly trapped. Then, from the corner of her eye, she saw movement. It was a figure, emerging from the depths of the darkness. Slowly, it stepped into the light. A man. But not just any man. He was wearing the uniform of a Walmart employee, but his face was distorted, twisted in a way that sent a jolt of fear through Samantha's spine. His eyes were dark pools, his skin pale and clammy, like something that had been buried for years. He was smiling. Samantha's blood ran cold. "Looking for an exit?" he said, his voice low and raspy, barely a whisper. "There is none." His grin stretched wider, almost inhuman, as if his face couldn't contain the malice behind it. He stepped closer, and Samantha instinctively took a step back, her eyes darting around for any sign of escape. But then she saw it. The door. It was small, almost hidden behind a pile of fallen boxes. But it was there. The faint glow of the exit sign lit it up like a beacon. Her heart skipped a beat. She ran. Her feet pounded against the cold floor, her body pushing past the dark shadows that seemed to reach for her. But with every step she took, the door seemed to move farther away. It was as if the store was stretching, pulling her back into its grasp. She was almost there. Almost out. But just as her hand touched the doorknob, the figure appeared again, blocking her way. "No one leaves," he said, his voice colder than before. Samantha looked at him, her mind racing. She couldn't give up. Not now. She had to break free. She had to escape. In that moment, the world around her seemed to collapse. The walls closed in, the darkness took over, and all she could hear was the figure's voice, growing louder, consuming her thoughts. "You're part of this place. You're one of us now. Forever." Samantha's hand gripped the doorknob with a desperation she had never known. Her heart pounded in her chest, her breathing shallow as the figure stood in front of her, blocking her escape. His grin stretched unnaturally wide, his eyes glowing faintly with a malevolent hunger. The store, the aisles, the shadows, they all seemed to close in on her, their cold, suffocating presence pulling her further into the darkness. "You can't leave," he repeated, his voice a rasping echo in the back of her mind. "No one ever does. You belong here now, just like all the others." She could feel the pull of the store, the weight of the curse that had been placed upon it. The walls seemed to press in tighter, the aisles stretching endlessly, as though the store itself was alive, feeding on her fear, feeding on her helplessness. But Samantha wasn't going to give up. Not now. Not when she was so close. Her hand tightened around the doorknob, her fingers trembling with exertion. She turned it, pushing the door open with all her strength. But the moment she did, something sharp and cold grabbed her from behind. She spun around, her eyes wide with terror, only to see the figure, now closer, too close, his hand outstretched, fingers curling like claws. "You should have listened," he hissed, his breath cold against her face. "You're ours now." The room seemed to collapse around her, the store's reality warping, twisting, like she was sinking into a dark, endless void. The figure's hands clamped down on her, and she screamed, desperate, loud, her voice echoing in the oppressive silence. But then, the unexpected happened. A sound, a loud crash, came from behind. Samantha froze, her body tense, and for a brief moment, she thought she had imagined it. But then, more noises followed. Voices, shouts, the sounds of hurried footsteps. The figure's eyes widened, his grin faltering for just a second. His grip loosened, and before he could react, a beam of light pierced through the darkness, bright and blinding. The door she had opened, was now wide. Not just any door, but an exit. The lights flickered above her, but they were no longer dim and cold. They were bright. She could feel warmth, real warmth. The presence of the dark figure, the curse, all of it started to fade, like a nightmare slipping away in the morning light. Samantha turned, her legs shaking as she stumbled out of the room and into the hallway, running toward the light. She didn't look back. She couldn't. She burst through the exit door and into the parking lot, gasping for breath, her body trembling with the aftershocks of terror. The night air was cool and crisp against her skin, and she felt an overwhelming wave of relief wash over her as the store's nightmare seemed to disappear in the distance. But as she took a few shaky steps away from the door, something caught her eye. A movement in the shadows at the edge of the parking lot. For a brief moment, she thought she saw something. Someone, standing in the darkness. It was brief, almost imperceptible. But she knew that the figure had followed her. Before she could react, the ground beneath her feet trembled and the air around her seemed to grow heavier once again. She spun around, her heart in her throat. But there was nothing there. Nothing but the silent, empty parking lot. Was it over? She didn't know. She couldn't be sure. The nightmare she had lived through felt like it had marked her, changed her. She wasn't the same person who had walked into Walmart just hours ago. She was a part of its story now, a part of the darkness that lurked inside it. Samantha took a deep breath and started walking. She didn't know where she was going, but she couldn't stay there, not with that darkness still lingering in her mind. The Walmart, the store of horrors, loomed in the distance. The faint glow of its lights flickered in the darkness, just as it had before. It was a place where lost souls were trapped, where the curse never ended, and where the shadows would always follow. And as she walked away, she couldn't help but wonder how many others had escaped, only to find themselves drawn back in. How many others had been consumed, just like her, by the store's endless hunger. The truth was, Samantha knew this wasn't the end. Not really, because some doors never truly close.